and welcome back to Phuket in Focus. It's hard to imagine a person with as much journalistic experience around the world and especially in the region than our next guest. David Armstrong has worked for Murdoch, he's worked for Packer, he's worked for some of the biggest media groups around the world, and also a wealth of knowledge of journalism experience here in Southeast Asia. David Armstrong, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you, Tim. It's good to see you.
How long have you been in Southeast Asia working?
All up about a dozen years, I guess.
One thing that strikes me now that I've been working in the region for the last year or so is that there's a subtlety to the journalism in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia and Singapore and Malaysia and Thailand that we're not used to in the West. And how would you describe those differences?
There's some differences. A lot of the journalism in the region is pretty safe kind of journalism. It's very straight and up and down, and a lot of don't ask too many hard questions. Maybe they're afraid of upsetting their subject. But sometimes you get the feeling that the journalist actually knows a bit more than they're quite saying, and you have to sort of read between the lines a bit to get the full picture.
Yeah.
And it takes a bit of experience, I think. I sometimes think that kind of reading between the lines approach is not necessary. I think in a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, the journalists have more freedom than they believe they have.
Yeah.
And I think that's true in Thailand. I think by and large, they don't push the boundaries hard enough in Thailand to find out where the real boundaries are. There are a couple of exceptions, but by and large, it's a bit softer than it needs to be.
You were speaking at IBAP a few nights ago,
Yes.
and one of the questions to you was about sort of the litigious ways of some of the Thai business people and the governments. Is it as big a worry as we think, or do we sometimes have too much fear when it comes to writing in Thailand?
I think there's the writers hold back too much. They anticipate the problems rather than working through them to see how much you can get away with. They anticipate a problem and draw back rather than pushing and perhaps getting some legal advice. How far can you go? That said, in Thailand, the penalties for defamation are much tougher than we're used to in the West. Penalties for defamation in the US, for instance, are almost nothing. Yeah. But in most Western countries, if you're found guilty of defamation, you or your newspaper cops a financial penalty.
Yeah.
Here, you can also
go to jail.
Jail, or if you're a foreigner, be deported.
Yeah. But in some ways, though, it's a restriction on the way, and I even know as journalism here in Phuket where the writing tends to be more creative writing than real journalism because of this fear that they're going to be sued all the time.
Yes, there's that. And also there's a kind of creative writing which is reporting what people hope will happen rather than what has actually happened.
Yeah. And
you get that a lot in political reporting in Thailand, I think.
How would you rate the two big papers in Bangkok here in Thailand, The Nation and the Bangkok Post?
Look, they're both pretty solid papers. I think the Bangkok Post is a little bit more reliable, a little more straight up and down than The Nation, which politically engages in the kind of creative writing we've been talking about rather more than Bangkok Post does. But they're both pretty solid papers. They hold their own against papers in the region, and they're not quite as vigorous or as robust as newspapers in Western capitals, but in terms of the region, they're pretty solid. I think that the best paper, pound for pound as it were, in the region, best English language paper is Phnom Penh Post, which is only a very small paper, just 24 tabloid pages every day, but it does a lot of investigative reporting. It challenges government, it reports things, sort of scandals and bribery scandals, illegal logging, which is a very dangerous thing to report in Cambodia because it's run by people who kill people to get in their road. And it's very tough and vigorous paper.
I noticed when I was there about 6 months ago for some of the genocide tribunals that the reporting in the Phnom Penh Post was second to none, and they were pretty vigorous.
Yes, and that's a difficult one because on the one hand it's a set of legal procedures, you have to follow the rules of legal reporting, which are their own restrictions. On the other hand, I think it's fairly plain that the Cambodian government would prefer that these trials weren't going on.
Yeah. They have to happen though.
They have to happen, and let's hope for the sake of the victims that they can get some progress on them. But the Cambodian government has been a little bit less than cooperative.
Before we look forward, let's have a quick look back.
Yes.
If you're going to try and pick out a highlight of your journalistic career, where would you be looking?
Oh, boy. Very hard one. Very hard one.
Or where you ask hard-hitting questions?
Yes. Look, there are some big kind of set-piece things. You know, covering the Olympics in Sydney, you know, it was almost a hometown paper. It was pretty big.
It was a defining moment in Australia, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It was wonderful. Sydney changed. For only about 3 weeks, Sydney became a nice place to be. And, you know, even if you're running for a bus, the bus driver would wait for you, which doesn't happen in normal times.
Yes.
That kind of stuff.
But for a nation that, in some ways, Australia, a very short history, a very young country, as an Australian, we sort of think, what are we? Are we Vegemite? Are we Lamingtons? How do you describe an Australian? And I think the Sydney Olympics somehow galvanised in that opening ceremony exactly what it was to be Australian.
Yes, which was pretty creative, pretty irreverent, and pretty forceful. Lively, exciting. And I think the Sydney Olympics, as I said in the iPad presentation, was the best Olympics. And each Olympics is meant to be the best Olympics ever. Sydney was the best Olympics ever until London last year.
Yeah, they were amazing. The opening ceremonies for the Olympics are, I suppose, a set piece for the countries that are putting them on. And I think China used theirs very well too.
Yes.
Anyway, we're moving away from the topics. Let's talk about the future, because there's been a huge shift in journalism. The model that we were used to for hundreds of years with print and press has changed radically, and technology is leading the way.
Yes.
Are the papers keeping up?
The papers are struggling. The model is with the digital media is so different that no one really quite knows how you work it, how you make it work, and how you make money. Which is a pretty critical question, because it's not just an issue of whether the company makes money. The issue for the readers and potential readers is who's going to pay for the journalism. You want to hire a journalist who's an expert reporter, or expert political commentator, or a business commentator. There are hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to hire those kind of people. When the internet first came as a threat to newspapers, and the newspapers really didn't know how to respond, and they got led down a bit of a garden path of putting all their information up for free. Now, there are reasons for that. One was that, and we tend to forget this, in the 1990s, the ethos that the internet is free was incredibly strong. So it's very hard to start charging people on the internet, except, unless you're a porn site, basically.
Yes.
The New York Times even tried to be a paid-for site, and they failed.
And Murdoch tried it
yes.
with the Daily.
Yes.
That failed.
That's failed. That's a complete iPad app paper.
Yes.
That's failed. So the newspapers had their websites. They were free. So that in turn was eating into their newspaper circulation. As far as the readers were concerned, there are now thousands of sources of information and news. So that was eating into their newspaper circulation, and there's no real way of fighting back. The thing that galvanised everyone, I think, was the Great Recession 4 or 5 years ago, because they just whacked newspaper finances so hard they had to start doing something. And the New York Times led the way, I think, with what they call a metered website. So after you read 10 pages a month, if you want to keep reading more, you have to sign up and buy. And that seems to be quite successful. We maybe not fantastically successful, because the New York Times won't tell us how much money they're getting, but they do say they've got 650,000 subscribers, which is not bad.
Once you've made something free, it's very hard then to get people to pay for it.
Yes,
but I think that the fact is that in the future, most internet models for journalism are going to be a subscription-based system. They have to be.
They are. If you don't keep a sort of newsroom type journalism going, then a lot of things finish. There are lots and lots and lots of bloggers of various sources in the world, but anyone who's blogging on serious subjects is relying on the information that comes from newsrooms in the first instance as their information, their raw material that they play around with. We have news aggregators like Google News and Yahoo. Now, where would Yahoo and Google News be if there were no more newsrooms? They wouldn't exist. You wouldn't be able to go to Google News and get your news for free if there were no more newsrooms.
Well, one thing you can guarantee about the future of journalism and the internet and print media is that it's going to be vastly different tomorrow than it is today, and even more different in a week's time, in 10 years' time, and we really don't know exactly where it's going to go, do we?
And that's exactly right. I think two things about this. One is, we take the humble mobile phone, now a humble mobile phone, something like a Samsung Galaxy SAM 3 or an iPhone 5. You go on a PC, it'll recognise you're on a PC, it'll present the news in that format. You go with your iPad or similar, it'll recognise it's a pad device, it'll shape the
page accordingly. Yeah.
It'll recognise a phone, and if you even go on with an old-fashioned Nokia, you know, as long as it's web-enabled, it'll recognise that and shape to that as well.
Yeah.
Now that's pretty clever, and that's fairly recent. If we'd had this conversation 3 years ago, we wouldn't talk about that.
We wouldn't have even predicted it.
Right.
Yeah.
So who knows what it's going to be like in 5 or 10 years' time.
Well, I think you just said it when you mentioned Nokia. 10 years ago they were the mobile manufacturing company. Yeah. These days, who's Nokia?
That's right.
And if you said 10 years ago that Apple were going to be making phones and be the biggest manufacturer of mobile phones in the world, no. It's exciting, isn't it?
They're just for creative artists doing the Mac.
That's right.
Yes. It is exciting.
And they still are.
Yes.
David Armstrong, pleasure to meet you.
Pleased to meet you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you. David Armstrong joining us on Phuket in Focus. We could have gone on for hours.
Yeah.